I'm going to show you how to look up versions via the Aria Operations REST API. Let's get started. Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. In this video and others in the series, we've been using Postman as the tool to invoke various REST operations. Now, in this particular setup, I know what my REST server is. I know that I'm specifically running Aria Operations 8.17.1. But when you move beyond using clients such as Postman or curl, and you actually start creating an actual REST client, you're not necessarily going to know exactly which version of a server you're going to be communicating with, because one user might be using the client to talk to, for example, Aria Automation 8.17.1. On the other hand, your same REST client might be used by another user to access another version of Aria Operations. So let's take a look at that in the lab environment. So how can you find out what version of the Aria Operations server your client's talking to? Well, as you can see here, I'm taking a look at the documentation for Aria Operations REST API, and down towards the bottom of the list here, we have a section titled Versions Info. Let's go ahead and open that up, and as you can see, we have two different endpoints that we can contact, including the first one that we're going to look at here is this one that allows us to get a list of all the versions supported. So let's go ahead and expand that REST operation endpoint, and as you can see, it's very straightforward. It doesn't take any parameters, and it simply returns a JSON formatted list of the different versions. As you can see, however, if you wanted to, you could work with XML, but again, to keep things simple here, we're going to work with JSON. So we can see the endpoint URL itself, and therefore we should be able to go over to Postman, and in Postman, we could create a request that looks up the versions of the Aria Operations server. Now, as you can see, I've already defined this request called get all versions, and it's pretty straightforward. Again, the URL is simply HTTPS followed by our Aria Operations server followed by /suite-API, which all of our REST operations begin with, /API/versions, just like we saw in the documentation. So why don't we go ahead and send this request, and notice that it fails. Notice we're getting a 401 status code, which is because we're not actually authorized. Now, in the previous video, we saw how to get authorized, so this should be entirely new for you. We're just going to go to authentication. We're going to make certain that we have an active access token. My token has expired since the previous video. So let's go ahead and send. And notice we get back a 200, so we've got our access token stored away in a Postman variable called AriaOps_access_token. So now we should be able to run other operations, requests such as the one that we were just looking at called get all versions. Now, as you can see, it failed before, but we're going to clear our response, and we're going to run this exact same REST request again. So let's click send and see what happens. As you can see, we've gotten back a status code of 200, and we've gotten back our response body. And this JSON formatted response body is giving us a list of all the different supported versions of Aria Operations. For example, I'm running Aria Operations 8.17.1, but there are numerous other previous releases such as 8.16.1, and if we were to scroll down through this list, there's approximately 44 of these currently. So lots of different versions that your client might be talking to. Now, we'll talk in a few moments to find out about exactly which version you're communicating with, but this here is a list of all the versions. As we continue to look at the REST body, you'll notice that we have different properties for each of these different versions. The release name property lets us know exactly which release we're running. We also have major, minor, and minor numbers that you can look at to see specifically what you're running. We also have the human readable version of the date that this version was released, and potentially also a description, plus one other piece of information here that may not be immediately obvious. This release date is the number of milliseconds since the UNIX epoch. If you're not familiar with that, let's go on over to our web browser. We'll go, this is just one site where you can look this up. I'm going to go ahead and go here, and what we can do here is plug in either in seconds or in this case milliseconds how long since, what is it, January 1st, 1970. So let's go ahead and copy this value here and take it on over to our converter. We'll paste in this number here, which again is in milliseconds, and when we tell it to do the conversion by clicking on this button here, it responds to us with a human readable version of what that number of milliseconds actually represents. And you'll notice that this here corresponds to exactly what we just saw in this nice, easy to use property called humanly readable release date. So again, with this first request that we're looking at in this video, we've got access to the information that we're looking for. And additionally, if you take a look at my post response script, you can see that I'm actually extracting the actual version. I could have picked any here, but for subsequent requests that we're going to make, we need to save the version that we're working with. So what I've done in my post response code is to go to the first release in this list, and specifically all I'm doing is saving the value of release name into the Postman variable called Aria Ops _ version. That way, later on in my Rust client, I can know information about that one particular release. But again, this list of all these different releases, please feel free to take a look at them in more detail, but this list of all these releases isn't the releases that I'm running. If you want to know precisely which version of the Aria Operations server my client is talking to, we need to use a different REST operation, which again, if we go back to our documentation, you'll notice that in our REST documentation, we have another request here, endpoint URL. In this case is API versions current, and that's going to give us information about exactly which version of Aria Operations our client is talking to. So let's go back to Postman. And here in Postman, we'll go to our next request called get current version. And when we run that request, first we check that we got back a 200 series code. And what you can see here is the same information that we saw from the previous request. But whereas the previous request was telling us about all of the 40 plus different supported versions of Aria Operations, here what we're seeing is the specific version of the Aria Operations server that this client is talking to. Now, as you can see, I'm saving that information into another Postman variable called Aria Ops _ version, so that later on in my REST client, I can know with 100% certainty exactly which version of the Aria Operations server I'm communicating with. Because as I suspect you know, that REST API changes over time, and making certain that your client knows exactly which version of orchestrator it's talking to is going to enable you to make certain that your client is using the correct REST API calls. Join me in the next video as we continue exploring the Aria Operations REST API.